Hello, folksies. Welcome back to the Philosophy for Philistines channel. Today we're going to have a discussion about the 95 Thesis. Yesterday was the anniversary of Luther nailing his thesis to the door of the cathedral in Württemberg and challenging the dominant political authority of his time to a debate. And in that vein, I'd like to engage you in a debate and tell me what you think. I have some ideas that I need to share about the collective unconscious and epigenetics and how group behavior is affected by this. Our personal ideas and our group behavior that will be adopted in a population in a certain area. So, I'll read to you today's notes. We cannot escape the collective unconscious, which is why humans cannot supersede the bounds of their own humanity. Ultimately, attempts to alter the manner in which we are nurtured to change our nature cannot escape this reality and are likely to have disastrous consequences. Yet every rule has its exceptions. For to my first assertion, we must add epigenetics, which is the study of the impact of epigenetics on behavior, both on an individual and group level, which is proof that every rule will have its exception. Epigenetics is the study of how our behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way our genes function. Unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible and do not alter our DNA sequence, but they can affect how our bodies will read a DNA sequence. Epigenetics is a chief consideration in behavioral genetics, which is the interdisciplinary effort of establishing causal links between genes and animal, including human, behavioral traits and neural mechanisms. Methods used include twin studies, quantitative trait mapping by linkage to allelic variants, transgenic animals, and targeted gene disruption or silencing. Complex stuff? You betcha. So permit me to attempt to fulfill the purpose of this channel and this particular podcast by distilling and synthesizing my hypothesis. Repeated behaviors based upon socially generated, generally held ideas will affect entire populations who live in the same social structure on an epigenetic level. But what does this mean in practical terms? Have you noticed the radical departure from what was previously, just 2 short years ago, defined as normal? The root cause for this departure is glaringly obvious. We are being fed toxic ideas which are undermining social order, which takes me back to the first premise that the ideas currently being foisted on us contradict human nature. Which leads me to the second premise. Epigenetic changes are occurring which cause people to accept toxic ideas. Allow me to cite what will happen when this becomes entrenched in society writ large, and therefore will define its social norm. In an attempt to establish a baseline for discussion, let me make clear the following. In Scandinavia, oh, I know, here I go again, right? Nevertheless, that society serves for the purpose of my own personal observations regarding societies under the epigenetic sway of literally becoming totally homogeneous in their thinking. The first thing one will note, as I did, in such societies is an unwritten code defining what the ground rules are. In Scandinavia, these laws are known as the law of Yenta, or tall poppy syndrome, as it is more commonly known in the Anglosphere. These attitudes were first formulated in the form of 10 rules of The Law of Yenta by Danish-Norwegian author Axel Sandemosa. In his satirical novel, a fugitive crosses his tracks. En flytning krydser sit spor. It was written in 1933. But the actual attitudes themselves are much older. Older is key to understanding how much epigenetics can and will affect an entire population. So here are the 10 rules of Yenta. The 10 rules state, you're not to think you're anything special, okay? You're not to think you're as good as we are. Get that through your head. You're not to think you're smarter than we are. You're not to think you imagine yourself better than we are. You're not to think you know more than we do. You're not to think you're more important than we are. You're not to think you're good at anything. And my favorite, number 8, you're not to laugh at us. Oh, I love that one. You're not to think anyone cares about you. You're not to think you can teach us anything. The Yenters who transgress this unwritten law are regarded with suspicion and hostility, and it goes against the town's communal desire to preserve harmony, social stability, and most of all, uniformity. An 11th rule recognizes in the novel that the penal code of Yenta is, perhaps you don't think we know a few things about you. Notice a constant referral to we and you in plural, e flertal, as they say in Norway. They think like the Borg. Straight out of Star Trek. I have spent more time meditating on this phenomenon than I care to share. I have, however, come to some conclusions which I will share since I have experienced it on a very personal level. I've seen the damage this mind pathogen has caused personally and to society. Allow me to summarize my thoughts in point form. It is a subconscious part of Scandinavian society. I have never met any Scandic person who says they like it. This is important to understand. In spite of this, they are all undeniably under its influence. It causes guilt in anyone who dare to buck the social consensus by speaking their own mind. It causes them to police one another by shaming or even by threat of banishment and loss of employment. And now we're seeing this in Canada. If you don't agree, the government is going to silence you, and that's why they're passing new laws even now. Trudeau just stated the other week there are limits on freedom of speech. It has virtually removed the need for government censorship since they censored themselves. Now that is what was most frightening to me in Norway. It is a necessary precursor for socialism, which could not exist without first having the host society completely under the domination of these rules. That's another extremely important thing, and that's why our government is foisting these very ideas on society as radically as they are. It creates a society which eschews excellence in any other areas other than in sports and the arts, which in the case of Norway is most often their adoration of musical prowess because, for whatever reason, per capita they've got some great players over there and have some fantastic music. Which is why it seems so odd to me that the people that play this music, in spite of the fact that you would think they would be individualistic, they are absolutely not. It has created a political system where the various political parties vary only in minor levels of adoration for total state control of society. It has created per capita one of the largest bureaucracies on the planet. Everything within the state and nothing outside of the state. It has led to one of the highest per capita consumptions of antidepressants on the planet. It has created a society which abhors criticism of their social zeitgeist and will react very negatively to any and all criticisms. And yes, I'm opening myself up to attack here. It prevents any real soul searching, unless it is to examine why you were not able to happily swallow the toxic ideology behind the law of Yenta. And that's where we're headed. You're seeing the censorship everywhere. You can't even state now the glaringly obvious reality of this situation we're in around COVID without having people lose their shit. So this is where we're headed in North America. At this present point in society, those who are older at least recognize how mind-crushing these ideas are, and they resist. However, our young people have come under the sway, and they're swallowing the Yenta code hook, line, and sinker. But let's examine the result of the good ideas that we've had in the past, and remember, in reference to the anniversary of Luther's 95 thesis, which was yesterday, on October the 31st, when he in 1517 nailed that thesis on the door of the cathedral in Württemberg. I have these following ideas about his ideas and how he and other reformers helped to create modern Europe. He was not perfect, and this should be made clear by my following points. 1. Identity politics of any kind is dangerous because it invariably creates a victim versus victimizer scenario, since Luther, as were most other theologians of his day, an anti-Semite. 2. Identity politics is also an excuse not to do the heavy lifting of judging each person based upon their character as opposed to their immutable traits, which Luther did address by putting the focus on the individual sinner and God's grace through Christ. 3. Nevertheless, the law must remain blind to our personal identity, which is vital, and if applied correctly, it will base its judgment solely on the actions of the individual. Individual accountability is a foundation for Luther's understanding of conversion. 4. Individual rights and freedoms are the very underpinning foundation for and the reason for modern liberal democracy, where even the government's own actions are limited by law to the point where the government must not enact laws which impinge upon our civil liberties and our property rights. This process of liberation began in its nascent form in Luther's time, as he unwittingly helped to dismantle the authoritarian hold that Catholicism had on Europe and the feudal society that it had created. 5. The identity politics of anti-Semitism did not originate with Luther, who merely propagated the foolishness of such prejudices. Such prejudices began in the Roman Catholic Church. 6. He reminded us that evil runs through the heart of every human being, and that we all need grace. This is why the most useful biblical metaphor is the one regarding mankind being awakened to know good and evil in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, the good that we do neither detracts from nor negates the evil that we do, and vice versa. 7. For those who may state that Hitler's anti-Semitism is Luther's fault, 1920s and 1930s Germany was not, nor currently is, entirely Lutheran. What percentage of Germany is Lutheran? A little over 60% of Germans identify as Christians, with the two main churches being the Catholics and the Protestants, who are mostly Lutherans at about 30% each. Point 8. The Reformation liberated Europe from the tyrannical dominance of the Roman Catholic Church and is responsible for the most remarkable period in individual economic liberty and personal autonomy that Europe has ever known. These effects can still be seen today, even among secular Europeans, since the region of Europe where Protestantism took hold are still the most industrious and prosperous, while the dominantly Catholic regions in the south remain economically challenged and backward. 9. Luther was only one of many reformers whose open discussion about church authority and the nature of forgiveness helped to transform Western thinking, particularly in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Britain, and Britain's former colonies. 10. A simplistic analysis of multivariate and complex human interactions has no utility whatsoever, which is why I'm engaging in this discussion with you. I want you to comment below and please get involved in this discussion with me. Luther was thoroughly human, and obviously he was a man of his day. Nevertheless, his good ideas led to action, which altered the very face of Europe for the better. Ideas can lead to epigenetic changes to an entire population, which will help determine how that society will choose to govern itself. Ideas which help to liberate mankind serve to create a healthy civil society are to be lauded, and ideas which seek to dominate, persecute, and denigrate our fellows are in fact idea pathogens. The ideas Luther had which accomplished the former ought to be lauded, and his ideas which accomplished the latter should be rejected and condemned. People of good faith and integrity, who philosophically and theologically share this tradition, must act in opposition to the prevalent ideas which are undermining our remarkable inheritance. Where the seeds of liberty were planted so long ago, one must wonder, I wonder, why so many who claim to be inheritors of this tradition obviously aren't acting upon it. So please, folks, there's food for thought, something to pray about. Please, let's get involved in this discussion and share these thoughts and ideas and this podcast with your friends and family. Cheers.